Well, hello and welcome to this second Encephalitis podcast of 2021 and the 12th in our series so far. This podcast, though, is super special and is part of our World Encephalitis Day Lights, Camera, Action campaign, where we're lighting buildings around the world red to raise awareness of encephalitis. And in this podcast, we explore To Olivia, which is a New Sky original film released on the 19th of February, about the relationship between children's author Roald Dahl and his wife, Oscar-winning actress Patricia Neal, and how their lives were turned upside down by the devastating death of their daughter Olivia from measles and encephalitis. I was very humbled to be asked to preview the film before its release, and it's a story of unimaginable loss and of shared grief, and how this grief becomes a source of redemption and strength, which changes lives forever. I am delighted to be joined by John Hay, the writer and director of Olivia, and the film's producer, Donall McCusker. Welcome to this Encephalitis podcast, guys, and thank you both for joining me.
Oh, no, thank you very much for asking us, yeah.
Look, when I first read the synopsis around To Olivia, I was intrigued. Encephalitis has been my life's passion, and it covers a key part in the lives of Roald Dahl and Patricia Neal, which of course is of great interest to me, and that's the tragic death of their daughter Olivia from measles and encephalitis. And of course the grief which follows in what was once a happy home, and that's something that we'll return to. But first, John, if I can ask you, where did the idea for the film come from? And why in particular was it on that chapter of of their lives that you chose?
Well, I'd like to say that it was sort of like, we focused in immediately on that period of their lives, but that's not true at all. I mean, I was always fascinated by Roald Dahl. I mean, I had a quite unhappy childhood, should we say, and I think Charlie and the Chocolate Factory meant a lot to me. I think it was one of the first books that I could identify with a child who wasn't like, sort of one of the Enid Blyton, sort of like Famous Five or something like that. And I think, I really related to the story, and it was just sort of like bigger and darker and, sort of like just had a quality, a tone to it, a darkness and light that sort of made me feel, even though I was a kid, a bit more of an adult in a funny sort of way. That's the strange thing that Roald Dahl can do. So I was working with Dave Logan, and we were talking about making something for ITV, funnily enough. And we both said, everyone's done everything on A.A. Milne and all those sort of like things, but nobody's really done anything on Dahl, and he's a very difficult man to capture, as you can imagine. And so we sort of like settled on that and sort of like wanting to make something about Roald Dahl. Now, I have to say, at this stage, I wasn't really aware of Patricia Neal as part of that story at all. I wasn't. And I sort of like started to read about it, and we thought, well, do we do a biopic? But that's sort of like been done already. What period of their lives? And, the key to these stories is to try and find one particular area or one thing with a single trope, and the trope to me was grief. And I thought, if we can make something, I've been through a lot of grief like all of us in our lives, and sort of like if we can make something about grief, that would be really interesting. So we looked at Theo, and obviously Theo, his son, they'd had a terrible accident in New York. It's absolutely fascinating because Roald Dahl built sort of worked with a model aircraft engineer and a surgeon to sort of like come up with this sort of like valve which was named after him, and that was really interesting. But it's sort of like finally we decided to make something just about his relationship with his daughter and how they both came through grief in different ways. And I think also very much about the 60s and, and how grief was looked at in the 60s, how you weren't allowed to talk about death. And I think death is one of the, it's still a great taboo subject for so many people. And I think particularly the death of a child. And anyone said, well, why would you want to make something about the death of a child? And I thought, but every time that I've experienced grief in my life, and so many people have, you've come out of the other side with something different. It's shaped and changed your life. And I think that's what appealed to me, the story, that it's about, how grief can inspire you creatively. and it has inspired me in the past creatively. And how both Roald and Patricia, you know, sort of like came through it. How Roald wrote Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Patricia ended up winning an Oscar for Hard, and you know, came through grief in that way, and became, and what became really important to them was, you know, sort of like vaccines, you know, measles, and then suddenly with COVID, this has just become, you know, very much part of the zeitgeist. But it wasn't intended in that way. That's just the way it happened.
Yeah, and we're going to come on to some of those topics a little bit
Sure.
later. Donall, you came on board as producer a little later in the process. So what attracted you to this project?
Yeah, well, I came on board. My first guys was as a line producer, and then I was produced it. So I came on board after the script had been written, and Hugh Bonneville was attached as well, albeit so it's fairly early stages. And I get sent a lot of scripts. We were just talking about this, and I first got a call from John himself, asking if I was available to make a movie. And I get a lot of scripts, and I read the script, and it was just a really, really good script. And I've got relatively young kids. I've got a daughter who's about the same age as Olivia was when Olivia died. And I just had so much resonance. And I think that there's something about, there's just something about trying to tell a story that drama works when it can tap into emotion. And I think that, you know, aside from the cynical nature of being a producer, I think that there was something in this story that could do what drama can do better than you know, news programs or whatever. It can actually tap into what it feels like to suffer grief, and I think the script, we hadn't made the film then, so the script certainly did that very, very well. And you know, and I came in also, excuse me, I knew who Roald Dahl was, but I wasn't aware of the death of his daughter. I wasn't aware of so much about that story, and I think that there's something about there's something very much about the script and the film that it didn't matter that Roald Dahl was this great author. It didn't matter that Patricia Neal was a film star. This was a movie about parents who had lost their daughter in unexpected and tragic circumstance. And the fact that we have a perception that we know who Roald Dahl was, or we have a perception that we know who Patricia Neal was, and to be fair, in this country, much more people know about Roald than about Patricia. That's actually secondary, and the fact it's a way in, but the really it's about, this is a film about Olivia and about her death and about the implications of that. And I think as a result, it's not a biopic, and it was never meant to be a biopic. It's much more about how that feeling and how that affects them, as John said.
Yeah, I think that, you know, you say why this particular chapter in their lives. It was also, I mean, when I read, when Stephen wrote his book, he obviously knew Patricia Neal, you know, just before she died. He was with her, you know, very, very close to the end. And by that time, she'd processed the death of her daughter and it became a memory. It became, you know, very much her. In his book, it's very much her looking back on it. What could she have done? Her guilt.
Sorry, John, just to explain, this is Stephen Michael Shearer, who wrote Patricia's autobiography.
Yeah, the biography, which it's based on. And because he knew Patricia, it was the way that she processed that and the way that she looked at it. So it had the quality. His book gave the story the quality of memory already. And I think that was something I picked up on, that I wanted it not to feel like a standard biopic, as Donall says, but something that has the quality, you know, the impact of a memory where you're, you know, it's postmodern in the sense that you're just selecting moments, you know, sort of like, and you know, your throat, you know, said, you know, you're not, the BBC version is you're sitting around the bedside with your, your dying daughter and holding her hand. We didn't do that. He was asleep at the time. You don't see those moments. You just like see it in a very, very intense way, like a series of vignettes almost. The whole story is told as a series of vignettes and has that quality of memory. So I suppose that was very attractive. And also on top of that, I imposed the idea of the 5 stages of grief with Dave Logan, my writer, that they went through the 5 stages of grief through to acceptance. And I think that's so, everyone has lost somebody. That book is just so important to me in terms of like understanding what I had to go through and the anger you feel and so, until you finally come to acceptance. And I suppose that's the hidden trope of the film.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about their reaction to Olivia's death, and I think in the film we see something where they react in very divergent ways. They react very differently from each other, and I think this is something that we often see in families affected by encephalitis, or indeed, other awful conditions where children are robbed from their parents and where there's a loss of a child. So can you just talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I think grief is, I think death is still a great taboo subject for our society. And it's very, you don't find many films about it because everyone goes, oh, why does anyone want to watch something about death? But the key to this was trying to find a way through the script that still came out with the positivity of like, that, in the end, you're going to be okay, that in the end, you're going to find your way through, that in the end, those who you've lost and love would want you to find your own way through and wouldn't want you to be sad forever, and I think that to me is when I think about those I've lost, I know that they want me to carry on, because if I don't, then I'm not, I'm carrying on for them as well. And I think that's something that really resonates with people I've talked to about losing people who are very close to them. And I lost my sister when I was young, I lost my mother, and my father disappeared. So all those sort of like things, and like, in my life, I've always wanted to write something about death, but try and find, that still has it sounds absurd, but sort of punch the air, a positivity to the end, in the end of it. And it's very, very tricky to do that and weave your way through that story. But the only way you can deliver that. Sorry, Donald. Yeah.
Just before you put everybody off watching our movie, I think the film that we've made is hopefully an uplifting film, and I think that grief is a process, but and it's a difficult process to go through, but it still has comedy and humor, and I do think there's quite a lot of comedy and humor in the film as well. Yeah. No, and I think you do need to balance it, because I think you get more of a punch from the lows if you have the highs as well.
Oh no, that's exactly what I was saying, Donald. Yeah, no, yeah, you're absolutely.
And also, this is Roald Dahl. This is,
But but this is Roald Dahl. His writing was very much about that darkness and light. And I thought at the end of it, you want people to come away from the picture and go, "Oh my God, I've just watched something that is very much akin to the feel of a Roald Dahl story." That sort of like the darkness and light that he has, that makes his stories very, very relatable to.
Yeah, no, it is about, it is a bleak topic. And I guess a couple of observations from me is, I think death and grief are very isolating. And so actually, I think many people will take comfort from this film because they'll feel that there's other people that have gone through the same as what they have or are experiencing. But you're right, it isn't just a bleak film. And I've got to come back in a minute to a burning question that I've got around death. But you're right. And, one of the bits that I really liked in the film was, I think Patricia was reading, his latest version or first version of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and he's outside pacing up and down like an expectant father, waiting for the birth of a child, almost to see whether he's...
That's exactly what I wrote in the action lines. So thank you.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, you can tell, at least it's true that I watched the film anyway before we did this podcast, but So that, you know, there are great moments in it like that. And you know, John, I'm sorry to hear, you know, that you lost your sister early on, but before we move on to some other things, that is a question that I had, because the film, to my mind, doesn't overlook the plight of siblings. So when a child dies and parents are grieving, and my question was going to be, what influenced your understanding of this? Is it's commonly overlooked, not just in families at the time, because people are so entrenched in their own grief and their own denseness.
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah.
You know, but it's also overlooked in the media a lot of the time. It's not something that's talked about, how the children are feeling, brothers and sisters, when there's been a death of a child.
I think so, and I think also parents feel that they have to, you know, overcompensate, you know, because of the death of a child. And I think that's, you know, kids are smart, aren't they? They know what's going on. They know, you know, I know my mum cried, but I never saw her cry. That's the interesting thing. And I think that's to answer your other question, which is with Patricia Neal, you know, I think that she, like so many women, particularly of that period, subsumed her grief and had to look after her husband, who sort of like, you know, I hesitate to use the word wallowed, but allowed him, you know, sort of like became very selfish about his own grief. Whereas she's never selfish. She has to look after the family, do everything, you know, and look after him and look after the kids, and also see that the kids are suffering and try and, you know, join the dots, make him realize that he's got two daughters and things like that. So she is like the moral center of the film in a way. She's very much the moral center of the film by default. So you think it's a film about Roald Dahl, but it's actually a film about Patricia Neal as much. It's very much through her eyes. And I love the scenes when Keely's alone with herself, and, you know, you just see her grief just like in those moments when she goes for the walk and things like that. But, you know, then she comes back and has to deal with a husband who's like, you know, been irresponsible to the degree he's almost allowed the house to burn down, you know, and then, you know, and her anger. Yeah, I think, yeah, all those things, you know, it's tough, isn't it? It is really tough, and everyone, you know, deals with grief in their own way. But I think that, you know, it's also about, I wanted to make a film about dealing with grief in the 60s. And I think there is, you know, through the lens of today, and I think, you know, I think you can relate to it in a way, you know, sort of in a way, because it's slightly distanced from you. Yeah.
Well, you've both referred to the complexity of Roald Dahl, the man, and perceptions around him. And that might not be something that many people are familiar with. But for me, I picked that up particularly in the film when Matilda, who was Tessa's doll,
Yeah, sure.
Hilda was Tessa's doll, that's right, wasn't it?
Right, yeah.
And Tessa being Olivia's sister. But as he grieves, Roald claims it was Olivia's doll and he locks it away in this trunk. But as he begins to adjust and kind of emerge out of some of his more darker hours, he returns the doll to Tessa. And I just wondered, I was just intrigued, was that an intentional metaphor, or was that just something that came out during the process?
No, it was very much intentional. I mean, yeah, it is it's a hidden subtext that you always look for. You know, you can't really ram these subtexts home, but obviously, yes, it's about his recognition, you know, that you know, he's seen things in the wrong way, that he's made he's had misconceptions, and that his grief has taken him down different routes and not made him see the truth. And I think that is the postmodern thing, isn't it? It's you know, memory is, you know, it's not just memory, it's whose memory, and it's who remembers things and how they remember things. And, you know, that's the great thing about books like Goldfinch, you know, which is a postmodern story in the sense that you have an unreliable narrator. Now, they're not fully unreliable as narrators, but there is a certain unreliable quality to memory always, isn't there? You know, we always remember things as we want to remember them.
Oh, 100%. I don't, how would we get through if we could all remember the truth sometimes?
Yeah, that's
we
right.
all create our own narratives, I think.
Yeah.
But, the question to both of you, my life work has been encephalitis and in particular outcomes for patients and their quality of life. So I wondered from both of you whether you'd heard of encephalitis before learning of Olivia's death. And did you do any research into the condition for the film?
Yes, we did. Yes, obviously. Before I started off being a film director, I worked for about 6 months as a psychiatric nurse, so I knew a little about it. And my daughter's a nurse, so we're sort of like, well, pretty gemmed up on stuff. And the interesting thing about encephalitis, is everyone thinks, oh, it's it's just one illness, and that can be detected in one particular way. And I think that's the interesting thing, that it's a symptom of so many things, and not easy to sort of like work out that's encephalitis. So what we tried to do, yes, we did research, but what we were also trying to do was tell the story very much as Roald Dahl understood it. Now, if you look at it, he was just like completely knocked off his feet, like so many people I'm sure are by it, that he was completely knocked off his feet. One moment she was like, just messing around doing these pipe cleaners. The next moment she was in hospital. The next moment she was dead. I mean, that sort of like, how do you come to terms with that, the suddenness, and how do sort of like parents sort of like come to terms with something that, seems sometimes really slight, and yet, sort of like can have such a major impact so quickly.
Yeah, I completely agree. I was just dealing with an email today from a young man we take calls from all over the world, but this particular guy was in the UK and he's just lost his father, and he said it so quick. I can't, is this even possible? Is this a thing? But Donall, had you heard of encephalitis before the film?
Well, I had, although I hadn't got any direct experience of it. I think that for me, actually, I think that what was a more interesting thing that I discussed with various people was vaccinations and Dahl's campaign against measles. And I thought that, being a cynical film producer for a moment, obviously you have to sit back and think, oh, we want box office and we want all, make profit and all that stuff. But what I think film does well is it can tell a story and it can reach out and convey a message, sometimes much better than news can. And I thought, I've been watching the anti-vaxxer movement and the whole the misinformation and all that sort of stuff. And I did think that when I first read the script, the idea that we can do something about vaccination, which at the time there's a little bit more complication to the story than we have actually portrayed, but there was a vaccine available, but it was in very scarce supply, and it wasn't generally available in the UK at the time. And so there was a potential that they could have vaccinated the kids against measles, but they didn't, because nobody was vaccinating the children at the time. And I think that by showing what not vaccinating the child does, and by showing the emotional grief that caused, I thought we could really do something in terms of trying to show, because I think nowadays people think of measles and they don't really consider it to be a deadly disease. They just think, yeah, it's a childhood illness, blah, blah, blah. It's like, like chickenpox. Hey, yeah, everybody got chickenpox, but you can vaccinate against chickenpox and you can vaccinate against measles. And what Roald Dahl did at the time, when it was actually in the 80s, I think, when he was campaigning most strongly, was that we can actually spread a message about vaccination. And yes, you're right, encephalitis is what kills people from the measles and how it's Olivia died, but it's a very strong message that we can get across, and how we can help spread that message. And I think that's a really important thing to do.
And I think also the interesting thing was, as Stephen said to me, the writer, he was with Patricia, Neal at the end, and she said, that I've never been able to second source this, so I didn't actually use it in the film, but he said they'd been advised to put the kids together, when she got measles, which was, was one of those things. And she just said, oh, thank God we didn't, thank God we didn't, I would have lost 2 kids, and my heart really went out to her at that point. But yeah, I don't think, there was no point at which it was an issue-based film that we wanted to explain it, because we wanted it to be, as I say, a memory, that it's very much through their eyes, and oh my God, how can it have gone this? How could we have ended up in hospital? How can she end up be unconscious? We wanted, that sort of thing. I mean, we didn't want to explain that, it can arise from viral or, sort of bacterial or fungal, or all those things, problems with the immune system. I don't know, all that stuff that you know about very well. We didn't want to ever sort of like go into that. We just wanted to show the absolute, the impact, the shock of it, and the speed at which it happens. And that was what I think in earlier drafts, we pulled it out far more. We had more explanation, but actually, in a way, it was just like boom, 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 and then she's dead. And I think that, to me, made it more of an emotional story, an emotional journey.
Yeah. And, it wouldn't surprise me if Patricia had been told to do that with the children. That unfortunately still happens today. They're called pox parties.
Yeah.
And, people, get all their kids together. It's just the worst thing. But, I was really, really pleased that the film ends with this really strong message about Roald and Patricia, becoming these lifelong campaigners for the measles vaccination. I think it's really, really important. But of course, this movie was made before COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, it's set, as we've all been alluding to, 60 years ago. And yet its release seems to be very prescient, given that we're in a world currently with questions around vaccine confidence. And people being hesitant of vaccines. Has that been something that you've been conscious of? I mean, you touched on it a little bit there, but how much do you hope that this film is going to be something that's really going to make people think and go out and get the right information about vaccination?
Well, that's over to you, Donall, because I think it's Donall's I have to say, his campaign more than me to really. I'm a filmmaker. I, would like things to be, subtle, but I'm not saying he doesn't want it to be subtle, but he felt that we had a very strong message and we should make it very, very clear at the end. And he very articulately campaigned to have that, to have the text at the end, which I'm really pleased we did. And I think that's, all part of him. Yeah.
Thank you for saying that, John. That was, I was a long and hard campaign was fought to talk about the subject. I think what's going back to COVID, and I know we didn't plan it; it wasn't a part of our marketing strategy, but I think that I think what COVID has done to the people's thought processes, and I think it has changed people's thought processes completely, is that I think they suddenly now realize, hey, there are diseases out there that actually kill you, and they can kill you. And even though oddly, measles, even the flu kills thousands of people every year, and there are vaccinations for both measles and flu. There were a lot of people that were saying that vaccinations were bad, that Bill Gates was, impregnating your mind or something. And I think that that you can do a lot of press releases, and Boris Johnson can get up and make a lot of podium statements, but it really doesn't get to the crux of what the flip side of not having a vaccine does, how you can die, and the grief that incurs. And it's not just an old person dying; it can be a child dying, and it can happen just like that, as John said, very, very quickly. And I think that while we obviously strive to make the best film possible and we want a lot of people to watch the film, because if we don't have lots of people watching the film, what's the point in making the film in the first place? I think that there is something you can do with film and drama that can touch people in a way that saying, you know, a poster saying have an injection.
I think so, and I mean, I have to say that I didn't resist the text at the end for all of the reasons that Donald said. I resisted it because I suppose at first I was worried. I didn't want it to feel like an issue-based film, because I think if people feel that drama is ramming something down their throat, they don't, you know, they walk away from it, they stand back. But in this context, and because of, like, you know, COVID coming up in the year in which we finished it, it felt so pertinent to not mention it at all. Just felt wrong in the end. I think that he was right, because you can't not see that parallel and not acknowledge it. And I think it acknowledges it without it being, you know, without it ever becoming a BBC 4 issue based drama, which I didn't want it to be. I wanted it to be a very emotional, from the heart drama that changed people's minds through their emotion, rather than through a more cognitive response.
And I think it is. I'm pleased that you got the messaging in at the end. And I think, you know, just a couple of points to make. Of course, not everybody dies from encephalitis, and
exactly.
You know, people can be left with horrendous injuries to their brain as a result of these diseases. So there's a variety of outcomes which doesn't always involve people dying, but people can be left with these life-changing disabilities. I mean, we're going to bring the podcast to a close shortly. I really would love to see the film released outside of the UK. So that's my plea to you and the people back at Sky.
Well, hopefully it will be. And,
yeah.
You know, we have sold it in other countries, and we hope to sell it more. So it will go around the world.
Great. Well, we're pleased to hear that. And I'll stay in touch with your people so that we can find out when it's going to be released in those other areas, and we can help make some noise about it, because it is a must-see film. But before I kind of bring the podcast to a close, is there anything that either of you would like to say that we haven't covered that you really wanted to talk about or to bring to the attention of the viewers?
No, I wouldn't want any. I would hope that people get drawn into the film, you know, because they're fascinated, you know, it becomes a fascination. I don't want to get people to be drawn into the film purely because of the issues, but I think that what we've got is something that tries to tread a very delicate, you know, takes a very delicate line, and I think that's the power of drama, I think, and you know, being able to tell a story with a very, very delicate, you know, spider's web sort of like ability, and I hope that that's what we've done. And yeah, absolutely, that's all I'd say. Donald?
Well, I would just, firstly, I'd like to thank you for inviting us on here. And I think that the work that you're doing is important, and I think that we're only happy that we can spread the word. And I think that it will benefit you to jump on our bandwagon and promote your message through the film, and hopefully through the film we can show people and express people some sort of empathy with the plight of those who are affected by encephalitis.
Oh, well, thank you guys. That's really sweet. I wasn't expecting that, but that's even lovelier. So thank you. Well, look, as we bring the podcast to a close, we can't thank you both enough for the time that you've taken today to sit and chat, and also for making this wonderful, honest film about these really important topics that we've been talking about. World Encephalitis Day is the most important campaign for raising awareness in our calendar year, so please find out more at worldencephalitisday.org. And if you have questions or queries about encephalitis and its impact on people affected and their families, then do visit encephalitis.info. Don't forget that our encephalitis services and team, we're still at your service. We still remain open despite COVID-19. It's not going to bring us down. If you've enjoyed the podcast and can support our work, then please do so at encephalitis.info/donate. So that just leaves me to say once again, thank you to you both, John and Donall. Please, everybody, watch the film to Olivia. And in the same way that young Roald in the film says that we will all become stories anyway, I'm going to finish with my favourite quote by actress and brain injury survivor Caris Kaufman, who said, if we all knew each other's stories, the world would forgive each other, wouldn't we?
Oh, that's lovely.
That's it. Thank you very much.
Very much.